morning the seedlings came, it was the first Tuesday of April in 1994, and the fog was lying so low across the bottom ground that I couldn't see the fence line from my own porch. I stood there with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and watched a flatbed truck feel its way up the county road like a man walking in the dark. And on the back of that truck, wrapped in wet burlap and stacked in crates, were 8,000 walnut seedlings that most everybody who knew me thought I had lost my mind to buy. They were little whips, most of them, no thicker than a pencil and no taller than my knee. And they had cost me 62 cents apiece, which came to $4,960, and to a woman farming 40 acres of ground that the county soil map itself called marginal. $4,960. I was 51 years old that spring. I had buried my father 2 years before, and I had been farming that same piece of bottom ground and hill ground for most of my life. And I want to be honest with you right at the start, because the getting there is the point of this whole thing, and I don't want to pretend I was certain.
I wasn't certain.
I was betting on something a dead man had written in a notebook, and I was betting on what I could feel with my own 2 feet when I walked that back 40. And neither of those things is the kind of proof you can show a banker. The man who drove the truck was young and polite, and he kept looking out at that field, while we unloaded, at the standing water shining in the low spots and the rushes coming up thick along the ditch. And finally he said, "Real careful, ma'am. You're planning to put walnuts in that?" And I told him I was. He didn't say anything mean. He just nodded the way you nod at somebody who has already made up their mind, and he helped me carry the last of the crates down to the shade of the machine shed, and then he got in his truck and drove off. And I stood there with 8,000 trees and a field the extension office had told me plain would grow nothing worth the diesel it took to plant it. 2 weeks before, I had sat across a desk from the county agent, a good man in a clean Carhartt coat with a clipboard full of columns, and I had told him what I meant to do, and he had been kind about it. He pulled my soil tests. He read me numbers. He told me the back 40 had a hard pan sitting 18 inches down, and drainage so poor the water couldn't get away in spring, and organic matter so low the ground was near dead, and then he gave me the number that was meant to end the conversation, the way those numbers always are. He said, honestly, on ground like this, you'd be looking at maybe $200 an acre if you tried to sell it, and I wouldn't count on the trees living past the first wet winter. $200 an acre. He said it flat and final, and he wasn't being cruel, he was being certain. And I have learned in my life that certain and cruel can do the same damage while wearing different faces. By noon that day, the diner had a version of the story, and by supper, the version had grown. I heard later that somebody said I'd bought 10,000 trees, and somebody else said I'd mortgaged the home place to do it. And a third fellow apparently said I'd gone soft in the head since my daddy passed, which I'll admit stung more than the rest because there was a grain of a real question in it. Then my nearest neighbor came by the second morning driving that pickup of his that never had a speck of mud on it no matter the season, a man who farmed 600 acres of good corn round on the ridge above me and did it well and knew it. He rolled his window down and looked out at my crates in my flooded field, and he said, not unkind, just plain, "What are you doing with 8,000 walnut trees on 40 acres of swamp?" And I told him I was farming. He chewed on that a second. He said, "That's not farming. That's a funeral you're paying for in advance." And then he rolled his window up and drove on up to his good ground, and I didn't have an answer for him that would have fit through a truck window, because the answer was a whole notebook long, and I hadn't even finished reading it myself. That's the part I have to confess to you, because it's true and because it matters. I had my father's notebook. I'd had it for 2 years by then, since the week we cleaned out his workbench after the funeral, and I had not read all the way through it. I'll own that. It sat in a drawer in the kitchen wrapped in a feed sack, a composition book with a marbled black and white cover gone soft at the corners, the pages filled front to back in his careful pencil hand, and every time I took it out, I got about a third of the way in and had to stop. Because reading a dead man's daily thoughts about weather and seed and the price of hogs is a thing you can only take in small doses when the grief is still green. So, I knew there was something in there about the back 40. I knew it because I remembered him talking about that ground when I was a girl. Remembered him standing at the edge of it in his rubber boots, with a strange, thoughtful look, saying things I didn't understand, and didn't ask about because I was young, and the creek was more interesting. But I hadn't gone and found the pages. I bought 8,000 trees on the strength of a feeling and a memory. And then, the night after my neighbor called it a funeral, I finally sat down under the one bare bulb over the kitchen table and read the whole thing through, and I found what my father had left me, and it changed how I walked that ground for the next 30 years. The notebook was mostly ordinary. Rain totals. First frost, last frost. What the sows farrowed, and when. The day the old red tractor threw a rod, which I remembered, and the day my mother's roses first bloomed the spring before she died, which I did not know he had written down, and which put me on the floor of that kitchen for a while. But threaded all through the middle of it, going back to the 1,950 seconds, were entries about the back 40. And they weren't like the rest. They were a man arguing with himself. Bottom ground won't drain, he wrote one April. Water stands 3 weeks past the ridge. And then, years later, a different tone. Walked a low 40. Elm and ash gone to the wet. But the walnut on the fence line stands 8 feet, where I set it in 48. Only tree that took. And then later still, the line that I read 3 times, and then sat back in my chair with my hand over my mouth because it was the whole reason I was in this. He had written in that careful pencil and underlined it twice. The muck is deep here, deeper than a man would think. Water below the hardpan, not just above. He'd drawn a little question mark after it. He never resolved it. He'd asked the question and gone to his grave without an answer and left me the notebook so that I might ask it too. Now I have to tell you what that meant to me, and why it set me against every certain man in the county. Because it comes down to the difference between what a soil test tells you and what the ground tells you if you stand on it long enough. The extension agent had looked at my field and seen a wet, dead, marginal 40 worth $200 an acre, and he wasn't wrong about the numbers he had. But my father had stood on that same ground for 40 years and seen something. The test didn't measure. He'd seen that the walnut he set on the fence line in 1948 had not just lived in that wet ground, it had thrived in it, grown 8 and then 20 and then 40 feet, while the elm and ash around it rotted at the root. A black walnut has no business-loving wet feet. Everything I'd ever read said it wanted deep, well-drained, rich bottom, and here was my father's one tree standing tall in the exact conditions the book said would kill it, and my father in his notebook had circled the reason without quite being able to name it. The muck is deep here, water below the hard pan. He was reaching for a thing he could feel through his boots and couldn't prove with the tools he had, and I decided, sitting at that table, that I was going to spend the back half of my own life proving it, or dying, with the same question mark he did. So the trees went in the ground. I'll not pretend it was easy or fast, because it was neither, and the not fast is the truest part. It took me and 2 high school boys I hired for $3 an hour, better than 3 weeks, to set 8,000 seedlings, walking that wet ground with a dibble bar and a bucket, 1 tree every 12 feet on the square. Roots spread and healed in, and the mud packed proper around each one the way my father wrote it down in that same notebook, 40 years before. Set them deep, pack them tight. Walnut wants to be held. We planted through mud that sucked the boots off your feet and through 2 days of cold rain in the middle, and when we finished, the field looked like nothing at all, like somebody had stuck 8,000 toothpicks in a swamp and gone home. My neighbor drove past a dozen times that spring and never said a word, just slowed and looked and drove on, and I understood that in his mind, and in the mind of every man at the diner, the funeral had already happened, and they were just waiting on me to notice the body. The first winner was the test. The one the county agent had promised I'd fail, and I will tell you honestly, it was a near thing. The water came up in November and stood, just like my father wrote. 3 weeks passed when the ridge ground drained, and I walked out there in my boots on the coldest mornings and looked at those little whips standing in an inch of ice-skinned water, and I did not sleep well. But here is the thing I learned that winter, the thing that started to turn me from a woman with a hunch into a woman with a knowing. I began to pay attention the way my father had, not to the whole field but to the ground under each tree. And I noticed that where the water stood longest, in the deep low center of the 40, the seedlings that came through the winter came through the greenest. That was backward, that was upside down from everything the book said. The trees in the drier corners, the ones any expert would have called the survivors, went yellow and sulky, and some of them died. The trees standing in the wettest muck in the middle stood up in April like they'd had a good rest, and that spring they threw new growth a foot long while the corner trees limped. I did not understand it yet, but I knew enough to know that my father's question mark was pointing at something real, and I got a soil probe that summer and I started going down after it. I want to slow down here and tell you about the probe and the digging, because this is the part where I stopped guessing, and it took me the better part of 2 summers, and I did it alone in the evenings after the regular work was done. End quote. A soil probe is a simple thing, a long hollow tube with a handle, and you drive it down and pull it up, and it brings you a core, a slice of the ground, standing there in the tube so you can read it like the rings of a tree. I laid out a grid across that 49 points, 7 by 7, and I probed every one and wrote what I found in my own notebook right alongside my father's, in pencil, because it seemed right to do it in pencil. And what I found, point after point, was the thing my father had felt and could not measure. Under the hardpan, that 18-inch layer of tight dead clay the extension agent had told me was a wall. There was muck. Black, wet, ancient muck, the rotted-down remains of a swamp or an old lake bottom. From before there were men here to plow it, and it went down. Where the county agent's certainty stopped at 18 inches, my probe kept finding black organic muck at 3 feet, at 4 feet, and at the deep center of the field, where I had to dig by hand with a post-hole digger because the probe wasn't long enough. I hit it still black and rich and wet at better than 6 feet down. 6 feet of the richest ground you can imagine, sealed under a lid of hardpan clay, holding water below like a buried sponge. That was the answer to my father's question mark, and I sat on the tailgate of my truck the evening I finally understood it, dirty to the elbows, and I said it out loud to him, even though he'd been gone 6 years. The walnuts loved that ground because their taproots, once they punched a channel down through the hardpan, hit a reservoir of water and rot and nutrients that no drought could ever touch and no dry summer could ever starve. The corner trees that any book would have saved were the ones stranded above the good muck, drinking thin water off the top. The center trees, the ones standing in the misery of a wet winter, were the ones whose roots had found the buried lake, and they were set up to grow like nothing the ridge ground could ever raise. My marginal 40, my swamp, my funeral in advance, was sitting on top of the best deep ground in the whole county, and it had been hidden under 18 inches of clay that made every certain man who ever looked at it turn around and write it off. The muck is deep here, my father had written. Deeper than a man would think. He'd been more right than he ever knew. Now, the years, and I'll pass over them quicker than I lived them, because a tree is a slow thing, and 30 summers of watching one grow does not narrate well but understand that they were the whole of it. Walnut is not a crop you check on in the fall. It is a crop you leave to your children. Or in my case, a crop I planted at 51, knowing full well I might not live to cut it. And that changes a person. You plant corn to feed this year, and you plant walnut to answer a question that will outlast you. And there is a peace in the second kind of farming that the first never gave me. Those trees came out of the ground slow, and then once their roots found the deep muck, they came on fast. And by the time 10 years had passed, they were up over my head and standing straight, and I had pruned them every winter for the one thing that matters in a walnut. You mean to sell, not for nuts, but for timber. And that is a clear, straight trunk, with no low limbs to knot the grain. My father's notebook had told me that too, in a line I'd read 100 times. Prune the walnut for the sawyer, not the squirrel. I pruned for the sawyer. Every February I went down that 40 with a pole saw and took the low limbs clean, tree by tree, all 8,000 of them, so that each trunk grew up smooth and knot free. A column of clear wood laying down straight grain, a ring a year. The neighbor and I made a kind of peace over those years. The slow kind. His good corn ground took a beating in the drought years of the late 90s, and again in a bad stretch after 2010. And I remember him standing at my fence one August when his corn was curling and burning up on the ridge, looking down at my walnuts standing dark green and untroubled in the heat. Their taproots, 40 feet down in water, he couldn't reach, and he didn't say much, but he said this: "Your trees don't seem to know it's dry." And I told him they didn't. I told him they were drinking from a lake that had been there since before either of our families came to this county. And he looked at me a while, and then he looked at my field a while, and he said, "I remember when I called this a funeral." And I said I remembered too. And he nodded, and that was the closest that proud good man ever came to saying he'd been wrong. And it was enough. It was more than enough. That is how the concession comes, out here, if it comes at all. It comes in a man saying he remembers what he said and leaving you to fill in the rest. I want to tell you about the buyers before I tell you about the billionaire, because the billionaire is the part everybody clicked to hear, and I promised you at the start we would get there, but the getting there is the point. Around the 20-year mark, which put us at 2014 and me at 71, those trees were what a timberman calls merchantable. And a small outfit that bought hardwood, a family sawmill 2 counties over, sent a fellow out to look. He was a quiet man, older than the extension agent had been, a man who'd been walking timber his whole life. And he did not have a clipboard. He had a little steel-diameter tape and a lot of silence. He walked my rows for the better part of an afternoon, and I walked behind him and kept my mouth shut, because I had learned by then that the men who know the most say the least. He put his tape around trunk after trunk, and he laid his hand flat on the bark and looked up the straight, clear length of them, and after a long time he stopped in the middle of the field, in the deep center where the muck ran 6 feet down, and he stood there quiet for a good while. And then he said one word. He said, "Exceptional." That was all. He said it soft, like it had gotten away from him, and I knew right then that my father's question mark had been answered in full, because a man like that does not spend a word he doesn't mean. He told me what he was seeing. Once he got to talking. He said walnut of this diameter, this straight, this clear of knot, growing this fast, on account of that deep water and rich muck, laying down this kind of even, tight, dark grain, was the kind of timber a sawmill sees a few times in a career. He said the growth rings told the whole story, wide and even, no drought years pinching them down, because those roots never went thirsty. He said the color was deep, a chocolate heartwood that veneered buyers pay dear for, and that the reason was the mineral-rich muck they'd been feeding on for 20 years. And then he did the arithmetic out loud, standing in my field, and it was the first time anyone had ever put a number on that ground that pointed up instead of down. He said the best of those trees, the veneer-grade logs, would bring somewhere between $800 and $2,000 apiece, and that I had a good many hundred of them coming into that grade, with 1,000 more behind them getting bigger every year, and that a mature planting, like mine, standing, not even cut, was worth well more than $1 million. And climbing. $1 million. On the ground, the county agent had priced at $200 an acre, $8,000 total. He'd figured that 40 was worth. The sawyer stood in the same field 20 years later and figured it past $1 million standing. And he was low, as it turned out, because he was only counting the wood. Word of a thing like that travels, even when you don't send it, and it traveled up out of these hills to places I'd never been. There is a kind of buyer for timber like mine that a small farmer never expects to meet, and I met one in the spring of 2016 when I was 73 years old. He came in a black car that had no more business on my county road than a piano would, and he was not the billionaire himself, but a man who worked for him, a lawyer, polished and pleasant and precise, and he had done his homework. He knew about my trees. He knew, better than I did in some ways, what I had, because his employer was a man who had made a great fortune and had turned in his later years to buying up the rarest hardwoods in the country, the veneer-grade black walnut that furniture makers and gunstock makers and the builders of the finest paneled rooms in the world, because there is so little of it left standing anywhere. The old walnut forests were cut a century ago and never replaced, because who plants a tree he won't live to cut? I had 8,000 of them on ground nobody else wanted, feeding on a buried lake, and I had done the one thing the whole market had forgotten how to do, which was wait. The lawyer sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read my father's notebook under the bare bulb 22 years before, and he laid out his employer's offer, and I will tell you the number because you have waited for it as patiently as I waited for the trees. He offered me $12 million for the standing timber, all 8,000 trees, and the 40 acres they stood on, the marginal ground, the swamp, the funeral. $12 million. He said it plainly, the way the certain men always say their numbers, only this number pointed a different way than any I'd ever been handed. And I sat there, an old woman in a farm kitchen, and I did the thing my father taught me without ever knowing he was teaching it, which is that I did not answer fast. I asked him why. I asked him why a man with more money than a county could spend wanted 8,000 walnut trees in the hills bad enough to send a black car up a gravel road, and the lawyer, to his credit, told me the truth. He said his employer had spent years searching the whole country and had not found a single stand of veneer walnut this large, this uniform, this well-grown, this straight, all one age, all one soil, all one careful hand. He said what I had made by accident and patience could not be bought any other way, because it could not be hurried into being. You cannot buy back the 22 years. He said, we can buy the trees, but nobody living can buy the waiting, and that is what makes them worth this. I did not sell them that day, and I want to tell you why. Because it is the whole of what I learned, and it is the thing I most want to leave with you. I sat with that offer a long time. $12 million is a number that will keep an old woman awake, and I'll not pretend I didn't lie there and do the sums, the debts it would clear that were already cleared, the ease it would buy at the end of a hard life. But I kept coming back to my father's notebook and to the line where he wrote, "Prune the walnut for the sawyer, not the squirrel." And I understood at last that he'd been telling me something bigger than pruning. He'd been telling me these trees were meant to be a long thing, a thing handed down, and that the point of them was never the selling. So I made an arrangement instead. I sold the timber slow, a few hundred trees at a time, the way you cut a walnut stand right, taking the mature ones and leaving the young to grow into their place, and I put the ground and the rest of the trees into a trust for my brother's grandchildren, who will cut walnut off that 40 long after I am in the ground beside my father. Drinking from the same deep water he found, with his boots and could not name. The billionaire got his logs, the best of them, and paid dearly and fairly. And the ground stays a walnut ground forever, which is what my father's question mark was really asking all along. So here is what I have come to believe, standing at the end of it. An old woman who planted 8,000 trees on dead ground, because a dead man left a question in a notebook. The certain men are not liars. The county agent was not wrong about what his test could measure. He was only wrong about what mattered, which is a different and more common kind of wrong. He measured 18 inches down and stopped. Because his tools stopped, and he mistook the end of his tools for the end of the ground. My father went deeper, with nothing but his boots, and 40 years of standing in one place, and the difference between a marginal 40 worth 200 an acre and a $12 million walnut stand was nothing but attention, and time, and the willingness to trust a thing you can feel but cannot yet prove. The muck was deep here. Deeper than a man would think, and the worth of a piece of ground, like the worth of a life, is mostly in what is under the hard pan, where the quick and the certain never think to dig. If you have got your own piece of dead ground, your own swamp that somebody handed you a number on and told you to give up, I would truly like to hear about it down in the comments, and about the dead man or woman who left you a question worth answering. And if any of this meant something to you, if you have got the patience for the slow way in a fast world, then subscribe and sit with me a while because we move slow on this channel, but we get there.